the differences between the four Gospels. That's the title of this module. I don't want to give the impression that I'm going to be able to raise and answer the question about the differences between the four Gospels in just one module. In one way, we're actually going to be spending the entire course trying to answer this question: what accounts for the differences between the four Gospels? Throughout this entire course, we are looking at the four different Gospels and the way they witness to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but they do so in different ways. And so, in a sense, throughout this entire course, we will be constantly looking at how the Gospels do this, but also the ways in which they differ, how they tell the story of Christ somewhat differently, what accounts for the differences in the details between the four different Gospels as they all faithfully witness to Christ. So in a sense, I'm raising the question here about gospel differences. I'm going to give you an initial attempt at an answer, but actually we're going to be spending the entire course looking at the differences between the four Gospels as they all witness to Christ. Okay, to get started, I want to tell you the theory that I was taught in the seminary. This was back in the 1980s. I hope all of you were at least born back in the 1980s. Sometimes when I tell people when I went to seminary, they say, oh, I was 5 years old back then. Anyway, this is a theory that I was taught back in the 1980s in seminary. It's now mostly wrong. Not entirely so. Rarely in theology is it that black and white. But in the main, the explanation that I was given in the seminary has waned since then and has been replaced by a more convincing explanation that I'll get to in a little bit. First, here's what I was taught. What accounts for the four differences between, or the differences between the four Gospels? Well, the answer was each Gospel writer wrote his Gospel with the needs of his respective community in mind. This was supposed to account for the differences between the four. Each evangelist took different aspects of the life of Christ, different parables from the life of Christ, different elements from the life of Christ, and then shapes his gospel always with an eye on his community. Each evangelist is addressing four different communities with different needs, and so given the different needs of these four communities, each one shapes his message to address and to respond to the needs of his individual respective community. And so back then we heard a lot about the Markan community. This was supposed to be the community that Mark was writing his gospel for. We heard about the Lucan community, the Matthean community, the Johannine community. This was all the rage back in the 1980s. In fact, a very influential New Testament scholar, Father Raymond Brown, wrote a small book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple, The Life, Loves, and Hates of an Early Christian Community. And in this book, Father Brown, who was probably the preeminent Catholic expositor of the Gospel of John in the last century, in this small book, Father Brown tries to identify the Johannine community, the community that John was writing his gospel for, and by surfacing the needs and the tensions and the loves and hates, to use his subtitle, that were operating in this small Christian community. Once we understand the Christian community that John was writing his gospel for, then we are able to more authentically interpret the Gospel of John. That's basically the approach of his book. Once we have an understanding of the needs that were operating in the community that the gospel writer was addressing, that helps to shed light on the interpretation of each of the four Gospels. Now this sounds reasonable enough. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense that each gospel writer would take certain things, include certain things, exclude certain things, and write his gospel in the hope of responding to the needs of a Christian community. It sounds reasonable enough, but several problems started to appear, I would say in the mid-1990s with this approach. First of all, the first and probably one of the most significant problems is, We have no evidence whatsoever for any of this. We have no firm, conclusive idea to whom Mark was writing his gospel. If Mark was writing for a certain Christian community, we have no conclusive evidence or proof for where that community was. Tradition says Mark wrote in the city of Rome. Then he would be addressing Christians in the city of Rome. And I put a lot of stock in that. But you'll find other New Testament scholars that say, no, it wasn't Rome, it was Antioch. And here's why. Or it was some location in Ephesus, in Turkey. Here's why. And so different scholars will come up with their reasons for why each of the Gospels had to be written in a certain locale. But none of this is conclusive. We have no definitive proof where any of these four Christian communities actually were. There's nothing in the Gospel of Mark that says that he was writing in the city of Rome. There are reasons for it that I like, that I find conclusive, but there are lots of other people who disagree. Same with the other three. We have no definitive idea where Matthew was writing his gospel, or to whom Matthew was writing his gospel. If he's writing for some specific Christian community, we have no conclusive proof just where that community actually was. That's a serious problem for this theory. A lot of interpretive weight is placed on these so-called Markan and Lucan and Matthean and Johannine communities. If we can't determine where those specific church communities actually were, well, that's a big problem. Another problem starts to surface with this approach, and maybe you can already start to guess what that problem might be. When so much emphasis is put upon the community in this approach, well, it almost becomes the community shaping the gospel rather than the gospel shaping the community. So much weight is put on these supposed gospel communities, the Markan community for the Gospel of Mark, that the community starts to form the gospel instead of the gospel forming the community. So we learned a lot from this approach, but scholars started to see that this approach had started to outwear its usefulness. We learned some things, but it was starting to direct interpretation in directions that many scholars became more and more uncomfortable with. If these communities were hypothetical, that's obviously a problem for this interpretive approach. But also for this approach to work, if there's a Markan community for the Gospel of Mark, and a Johannine community for the Gospel of John, and a Lucan community for Luke, well, this theory only works if each community is entirely separate and self-contained, isolated from the others, unique unto itself. I mean, if Mark is supposedly writing a gospel just for one isolated specific community, well, then that community needs to be at some remove from Matthew's and Luke's and John's. And people started, again, questioning this approach, saying, were the early Christian communities like that? Was the supposed Markan community that removed, that separated from the other Christian communities? Is that the way it actually was back then in the first century? And a lot of evidence soon started to pile up to the contrary, that these supposed individual Christian communities were not at all that isolated, that separate, that unique, that there was a lot more connection between the early Christian communities than this theory would allow. Let me present some of that evidence to you now. Let's start with what's called the Cursus Publicus. This is a map of 4th century roads in the Roman Empire. This is technically called the Peutinger table because a man by the name of Conrad Peutinger was an art historian and a collector of antiquities, and he collected all of these maps. What are we looking at here? This is a medieval copy of 4th century maps of roads throughout the Roman Empire. Cursus Publicus is just Latin for public roads. So this is really a road map of the ancient Roman Empire. And although it's a couple of centuries after the time the Gospels were written, at least in terms of the composition of this map, it goes back to practically the time of Gospel composition. 1st century, late 1st century, early 2nd century. What we have on this slide then is a medieval copy of a Roman road map. This cursus publicus, this road map, this was something prized by the medieval monks. Again, they are the ones who keep copying these things down and handing them down and making sure that if one copy is worn out, they make another one before they lose it. And we can see why. During the Dark Ages, when civilization starts to disintegrate, as society is falling apart, at least the society of the Roman Empire, the monks knew that they had to hang on to this information. As the Dark Ages descended, having information like this, knowing how to get places, knowing how to stay connected to other cities was of extreme importance during the Dark Ages. So the monks, even though it wasn't something religious, the Benedictine monks religiously copied these Roman road maps. They did not want to lose this information. If they lost this information, they would be cut off from the other monasteries of Europe. They would be isolated themselves without these road maps. So the monks kept making copies of this. And they felt obliged to hand on the knowledge of where these roads were so that they would never fall prey to that kind of isolation. Now let's look at this. This is obviously not to scale, obviously, but it's obviously also a map of central Italy. You can see the landmass in the middle, there's water on either side. This really is just a section here. This thing's about 13 feet long, it's just about 1.5 feet wide. But what they did was they had the entire Roman Empire divided up into sections, and so every corner of the Roman Empire had a map of the roads in that section. So what we see here is just the central part of Italy. We see the two bodies of water, the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. We see hills, rivers, etc. Again, it's not to scale, but it's obviously of Italy. But it's not the natural landmarks that are most interesting to us, but rather the man-made landmarks. Notice over on the left, you see a man sitting on a throne. That is obviously Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Empire. And you can see Roma, the word Roma, written on either side of this emperor. Now notice how each road that goes out of Rome has a little jog in it. That jog, that little zigzag, that designates a rest stop. Every rest stop that's indicated on this map is put at the end of one day's journey on foot. That accounts for all these little zigzags in these roads. Every time you see a little zigzag, a little jog along the way, that's how far you could reasonably expect to get in one day's journey on foot. Now notice, they're not evenly spaced because, think about it, you could go farther over flat ground than you could over hills and mountains. So it was very accurate information here with these little zigs and these little zags. It showed a person how far he could get one day's journey by foot. Now also notice the different buildings that you see here along the way. Some are just one or two little towers. Those would be the most humble hotels. I guess those are the Motel 6s of the ancient world. And then you have bigger buildings. Let's call them the Marriotts of the Roman Empire. You get the idea. Nicer buildings, bigger buildings. Some of them are shaped around courtyards. Those would be the nicest places on the map. Those would be the Four Seasons hotels of the ancient world. So very detailed, very important information, how far you could get on one day's journey, where you could stay throughout the whole Roman Empire. Now, it's enough just to look at this map to demolish the old theory that I learned back in the 80s, that each gospel community was this unique, isolated, separate community cut off from the other three. This map proves that thinking wrong. Traveling was relatively easy in the Roman Empire. People did it all the time. They could even know how far they could get with each day's journey and where they could stay. So the idea that there were these unique and isolated, separated Christian communities that each of the four evangelists was addressing, well, it flounders, that idea, just by looking at this map. Communication was easier back then than we think. Travel was common. Groups were not hermetically sealed off from others. I mean, that's just not the way life was lived back then, and something as common as a road map can prove it. Communication was very common back then. The Roman Empire was so strong because of the system of roads that the Romans built. And you can see that, you can be impressed by that just by a glance at this map. So that was one bit of convincing evidence, starting to bring down this idea that each gospel writer was addressing just one certain specific isolated Christian community. But it's not just enough to look at, it is enough to look at Roman maps to get that idea, but there's other evidence. The more people started thinking about this, again, back in the 1990s. It's enough to look at Paul's 4 journeys to see just how much that man traveled. Look where that man went. He went all over the Mediterranean, and with those 4 missionary journeys, it's amazing what that man did. Some of it he journeyed by boat, but look at all the places that he went on foot. Now, this is very common for us Christians as we study the New Testament. Everybody knows about the 4 missionary journeys of Paul. But it's not just Paul who traveled. If you read Acts of the Apostles, just look where Peter goes. Peter goes to Jerusalem. We read that in Acts, starting chapter 1 through 8. Then he goes to Samaria. That's chapter 8:14, Acts of the Apostles. Then to Lydda, Joppa, Caesarea. That's Acts 8:32 to 10:48. Then we know that he was in Antioch. We get that from Galatians 2:11. And that, of course, he ends up in Rome. We know that by 1 Peter 5:13. So it wasn't just Paul who was traveling. Peter does quite a bit of traveling himself. How about somebody who actually wrote one of these Gospels? Well, let's look at Mark. We know he was in Jerusalem. We find proof of that in Acts 12:12. We know he went to Antioch. That's Acts 12:25. To Cyprus, Acts 13:5. To Pamphylia, Acts 13:13. Back to Antioch, back to Jerusalem. Then to Cyprus, that's Acts 15:39. Then to Rome. We know that he was there, 1 Peter 5:13. Now, don't write those references down. You don't need those for any kind of later exam question. The point I'm trying to make is people traveled quite a bit back then, and by foot. Now, we think that's a daunting thing to undertake. They didn't. Travel by foot was commonplace. And besides the extensive travels of Paul, we know that Peter, Mark, and so many of the apostles and other key figures of the New Testament, they traveled extensively by foot. So the idea, again, that each gospel writer was addressing separate, isolated, individual communities, it just doesn't hold water the more people started thinking about it. And again, I mentioned Mark. Look at all the places Mark went to. We know that he went to several cities throughout his travels, but when it came time for him to write his gospel, that he was supposedly addressing one specific community, to which community was he writing? Was it Rome? Was it Antioch? The idea that he, after traveling all of those places, would write a gospel for just one specific small Christian community, well, closer scrutiny makes this older theory that I learned demolished, actually. So, as we get ready to read some New Testament scholarship, I would suggest to you, be leery of any theologian or scholar who makes too much of a supposed Markan community or a Lucan community or a Johannine community. That kind of thinking goes back to, I would say, the 60s through the 80s of the last century. And we've started to move past this. Now, again, one of the pillars of Catholic New Testament scholarship was Father Raymond Brown, who was extremely influential back in the time frame that I just mentioned. What's distressing to me today is I hear and read about all of these Father Brown bashers. You can find them on Google. There are people who have blogs who say he was a modern day heretic and just really outrageously offensive stuff. Now, he had this older idea that the Gospels were addressed to specific communities, but that hardly makes him a heretic. One can learn an enormous amount from Father Brown. No one's scholarship is ever 100% impeccable. Everything gets revised, well, I should say, most things get revised as we go along, and so please don't join the camp of those who rise up against Father Raymond Brown and want to dismiss him as some sort of modern-day heretic. The man was brilliant and so learned, and one can learn an enormous amount from him. Again, as you should know by now, whenever we read anyone, we always read theology with a little bit of a grain of salt. Again, nothing is perfect, and no theologian has the definitive last word on some of these issues. So that's my pitch for you you can learn a lot from Father Brown, although I will say that some of his key foundational ideas have been modified, and we are moving forward along different lines, where I would say that much of what he wrote was just so brilliantly argued that it will stand the test of time. Now, one idea that Father Brown did have that we are now revising is he didn't think that the Gospels were biographies. The tradition was that the Gospels were early Christian biographies of Christ, and Father Brown did not think so. Why not? Well, again, remember, he thinks each evangelist is writing to a specific community, addressing the concerns of a specific community, and one doesn't write a biography to address the needs of a specific community. And so, because he had that idea in his mind, he didn't think of the Gospels as biographies. He thought of them as a different genre, as something that was this new form of literature addressing the needs of specific communities. He also thought, when you think of biography, a modern day biography, what does it give a person? It gives us all the inner motivation. It gives us the early childhood elements that form that person's character, all the events of his childhood, his or her childhood. It talks about his or her character and the formative elements that went into forming a person's character. So if we have a biography of Abraham Lincoln, we get all of those childhood details. We get the things that helped shape his character and what formed him as a man. And that's what modern biography does. And we know the Gospels don't do that. We get very little about the inner motivation of Christ. We don't have much that tries to explain the formation of his character. Two Gospels don't give us much about his childhood at all. In Mark's Gospel, he starts right in the desert with John the Baptist. So Mark's Gospel skips over his childhood entirely. And so because of these reasons, Father Brown thought, well, the Gospels aren't biographies. And so he, developed different ideas for what they were. That thinking has been overturned. And one man who did this, it's really amazing how one little book can just shift scholarly attention so dramatically. A man by the name of Richard Burridge completely overturned this idea that the Gospels are not biographies. He wrote a book called What Are the Gospels? A comparison with Greco-Roman biography. And in this book, he just utterly convincingly established the position that the Gospels are not modern-day biographies. Of course, we shouldn't think of them like modern-day biographies, but they're very much along the lines of Greco-Roman biography. And so the things that go into a typical Greco-Roman biography, we see this in the Gospel as well, in the four Gospels as well. Now, because we always thought of the Gospels as biographies of Christ, I don't need to go into his arguments for you. You probably started this class thinking of the Gospels as biographies, and we have returned to that position, so no need to cover all of that ground. But it's a wonderful book, you can learn a lot from Richard Burridge, and the reason I bring it to you is because of this one book published in the mid-90s. It has reversed scholarly opinion, and now it has shifted it back to considering the Gospels truly as biographies of Christ. And it also, this idea of the Gospels as biographies, it links back to something that I presented earlier in this module. Biographies are written for everybody. Biographies are meant to circulate widely. Biographies are not written for individual specific communities. Biographies are written for anybody who wants to read them. It has a universal audience. And so, just as we saw from the maps of the Roman Empire, how communication was quite common and people traveled quite frequently, because there was such widespread communication, we know now from those maps, well, now we're starting to see that the Gospels were meant to circulate widely and freely as well, that they were not written to address individual specific communities, but they were addressed to everyone. And so they could have circulated freely throughout the Roman Empire. Gospels as biographies of Christ that circulated freely throughout the Roman Empire, that were meant to circulate freely. Biographies are meant to circulate, so how did the first Gospel circulate throughout the Roman Empire? Well, that's a question that's easily answered, actually. The Gospels all circulated by being written in the form of a codex. I want to explain now the difference between the codex and the scroll. It's, I think, a very telling and key distinction. All of the Gospels were written in the form of a codex. They were written like codexes. What is a codex? Well, here you can see a picture of a codex. Now, don't think of it as a book. A codex was not so much a book. Don't think of the codex as a book. The codex was not made of paper, and book technology will not be invented until Gutenberg, so we're still centuries away from having books. What we have in the ancient world really are two things: scrolls and codexes. Okay, this is a codex that we're looking at here. Well, what was a codex then? Well, there are several different kinds. The most common codex was made of individual sheets of wax, not paper now, but wax, and these wax sheets were bound together, and since you were working in wax, you could smudge out what you wrote and rewrite it. You could write over what you originally wrote. You could erase it or smudge it out if you wanted to write something new in your codex. And to write on your codex, you used a stylus. You can see that over to the side. A stylus was a pen, or really a tool, that was made for scratching facts and figures and words into the wax. The stylus was not a pencil, but rather a tool used to write in wax. Now, don't think that the Gospels were written on wax. They are going to be written on parchment, and then they're going to be stitched together, these parchment pages, but they're going to be stitched together into the form of a codex. So I just wanted to say that right up front. But why is it a big deal that the Gospels appear in the shape of a codex? Well, think of who would use a codex back then. Now I'm thinking of the wax codexes. Who would use a codex? Well, shopkeepers used a codex, since you could write up your inventory and then you could smudge it out next week when new inventory arrived. Accountants and bookkeepers used a codex because, again, you could tally things up and then smudge it out and then come up with a new tally. Women used the codex. Women were the ones who kept charge of all their household items, the grocery list, all kinds of things that women would have to keep track of in order to run a household efficiently. It was the working class that used the codex. The codex was very much associated with the shopkeepers and bookkeepers and women in ancient Rome. Here you see a woman from Pompeii using a codex. You see it here with her codex and with her stylus. She's holding the stylus up to her mouth. It's a little fuzzy, I admit, but the woman's obviously lost in thought. She's probably keeping track of something, getting ready to write something on her codex, something that she wanted to keep track of. Now this image is from 79 AD from Pompeii, and we know what happened later in 79 AD, not too long after this woman was depicted here in this painting. Pompeii was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius, and an entire town was buried alive by soot, ash, and lava. 79 AD, that's about the time that Mark was writing his gospel. 79 AD, about the time this woman was writing on her codex, Mark was writing his gospel on parchment and then stitching it together in the form of a codex. Now, Mark's decision to use a codex for the gospel instead of a scroll is very telling. The scroll was the symbol of Roman nobility. It was a symbol of wealth. Only wealthy men could afford to have scrolls back then. High literature was written on scrolls. I mean, Cicero wrote everything he ever wrote in that gorgeous, elegant Latin on a scroll. Serious, classical, pagan Roman literature always went into scrolls. Nothing of literary value was put on a codex. I mean, a codex was for your shopping list, for your grocery list, for your list of pots and pans in your store. That's the kind of thing that went on a codex. And remember, it was women who used the codex, at least in the house, in the household. Only men used scrolls. A wealthy Roman man would never stoop to writing any of his lofty thoughts on a codex. I mean, the codex was for women and shopkeepers and the working class and businessmen. High literature was always, always, always written on a scroll. I mean, putting high literature on a codex would be like Shakespeare writing Hamlet on yellow Post-it notes. I mean, it just wasn't done back then. Roman men read scrolls. Women used the codex. Roman literature, classical literature, all of that's on scrolls, not on a codex. But of all the Christian literature that we have from the 1st and 2nd century, 70 to 80% of everything that we have from the early Christians, it's all on the codex. It's not written on scrolls. And this is very telling. Again, scrolls were for the wealthy upper class. All Christian literature, or the vast majority of it, is written in the form of a codex. Hardly anything Christian is put in the form of a scroll. And I think now we can see why. Again, the codex is for accountants. It's not for sacred writing. So why did Christians use the codex? Well, as we know, Christianity did not spread rapidly among the upper wealthy classes of Rome. Christianity spread primarily through the working class. Now, it wasn't the destitute and the poor. It was primarily the working class that responded to Christianity. Some of the lower class, some of the very poor did, and a few of the wealthy did. I don't want to suggest that none of the upper class of the Roman Empire embraced Christianity early on. A few did. Isolated individuals did, but far and away, Christianity makes its most dramatic growth among the working classes, among the shopkeepers and the bookkeepers, and among women. This is the group that receives Christianity, the group that is comfortable using the codex and does not see a stigma to using the codex. These are the people who first embraced Christianity, and so the earliest Christian gospels circulated throughout the Roman Empire on the codex, but not on the scroll. And then this is a real difference between Christianity and Judaism as well. I mean, have you ever been to a Jewish synagogue? When they pull out the Torah scrolls, the Old Testament is written on a scroll. The Old Testament is not written on a codex. Again, the sacred writings of Judaism appear always in the form of the scroll, the Torah scrolls. There are no such things as Torah codexes. Everything that the Jews wrote with respect to the Old Testament is written in the form of a scroll. Christian literature, however, again for reasons that we now know, circulates in the form of a codex. Now, I think there's something else that I want to tease out of this difference between Jewish and Christian sacred writings. Jews, of course, experienced the presence of God through the Torah scrolls. It was on these written Torah scrolls that Jews encountered the presence of God through the Old Testament writings. Where did Christians experience the presence of God? Of course, Christians also experience the presence of God through the Torah scrolls, but someplace else. Christians also experience the presence of the risen Christ among each other. The presence of the risen Christ was also among the poor. The presence of the risen Christ was palpably felt in each other's homes when they gathered for meals, especially for the Eucharist. It was experienced when they were working for and with the poor. The presence of Christ was not just limited to the temple, obviously, for Christians, nor to the Torah scrolls. The presence of the risen Christ was felt in each other, in their fellow Christians. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, the presence of Christ was also there. And so Christians did not feel bound to put their early writings in the form of a scroll like the Jews did. They sensed the presence of God through the Torah scrolls, of course, at least the first generation of Christians did. But over time, they sensed the presence of Christ elsewhere, and so they had no problem putting their writings in the form of a codex and using that, because the presence of Christ was not just restricted to the written scrolls. It's a sign of the resurrection, in my opinion, to put early Christian writings in the form of a codex. They knew, the early Christians, the gospel writers, that the presence of Christ was not restricted to the scrolls, but the presence of Christ was also in the community, in each other, in the liturgical assembly, at the Eucharist. The presence of Christ was alive and living among them. And so putting early Christian literature on a codex, it wasn't just a sign that Christianity was spreading among the working class. That's true. But the greater theological point, in my opinion, is that the presence of Christ, the risen Lord, was not just restricted to the scrolls, but was also experienced and felt among the Christian community, especially when gathered at the Eucharist. Okay, that's how that's how Christian literature circulated throughout the Roman Empire in the form of a codex, and now we see why. Okay, so we have Gospels circulating widely throughout the Roman Empire. We know a little bit about how they circulated. One question that I'd like to raise now, and it's the last question that we will primarily concern ourselves in this module, is which Gospel came first? If we have these 4 Gospels circulating widely throughout the Roman Empire, which one circulated first? Well, maybe you learned this bedtime prayer that I did as a little boy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lay on, bless the foot, and bless the head, and bless each corner of the bed. It's a beautiful prayer, and again, it brings back wonderful memories just reciting it into this camera for you. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have Matthew as traditionally the first gospel. Matthew before Mark, Luke, and John. That was the traditional order, but I'm sure this will not come to your surprise. New Testament scholarship has questioned whether Matthew was the first one. The consensus opinion now is that Mark was the first gospel to circulate, that Mark wrote his gospel first before Matthew and Luke. And that's what I'd like to look at now. Which of the gospels came first, and why do scholars now think that Mark was the first one written? This is a classic problem in New Testament scholarship. It's called the synoptic problem. Now, we know what synoptic means from the previous module, seen together. And so we are looking at the differences here between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is not considered one of the synoptics, and no one ever thought John was the first gospel written. It's obviously a later gospel. So the synoptic problem revolves around the question, which of the 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, came first? And it also looks at the similarities and the differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This is the synoptic problem. Which came first, and what accounts for the similarities and differences? I'm going to take a stab at that question here. Let's look at this. Don't freak out over this when you see it. This shows the relationship between the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This really is all about the similarities and the differences between the three synoptic gospels. Let's look at the purple first, the so-called triple tradition. Notice it's in the center of this. According to a close reading of these three gospels, 76% of Mark and 41% of Luke and 45% of Matthew all say the same thing. This is the triple tradition. This is what is similar to all three of the synoptics. 76% of Mark, 41% of Luke, and 45% of Matthew are all about the same thing. So it's mostly about the passion of Christ, the passion narratives, the main miracles in the Gospels, mention of John the Baptist, things like the temple, the Pharisees, the things that are in all three Gospels. This is the triple tradition. 76% of Mark, 41% of Luke, and 45% of Matthew all relate much the same thing. But now let's look at what's called the double tradition. And this is the relationship just between Luke and Matthew. 23% of Luke and 25% of Matthew say the same thing. This is called the double tradition. This is what's common to Luke and Matthew, but does not appear in Mark. So 23% of Luke and 25% of Matthew say the same thing, but it's not in Mark. What's in Luke and Matthew in the double tradition does not appear in the Gospel of Mark. Let me make this point here. Let's look at this image here. It's all Greek to you and me. If you take Biblical Greek, you'll be able to read this after a year. But notice the color of these words. It doesn't matter for you to be able to read these words. It's enough for you to see the red versus the black or gray on your computer to notice the similarities between Luke and Matthew. This is that excoriating speech by Jesus, "You brood of vipers," when discussing the Pharisees. It's not in Mark. This "you brood of vipers" speech does not appear in the Gospel of Mark. It's only in Luke and Matthew. But what's interesting here is not that Luke and Matthew are just recounting this. Notice they are recounting it almost word for word, verbatim. They are using Matthew and Luke here. They are using the exact same words. It's like they're copying each other. I mean, if you were a grade school teacher and you saw two papers turned in that agreed word for word the same, that would be your conclusion. They copied each other. Now, copying is not a crime outside of school, but this word for word agreement here, it's not a coincidence. Someone is copying off of someone else here. Is Luke copying off of Matthew? Is Matthew copying off of Luke? This double tradition has so much agreement between it, word for word, that somebody's copying off of the other. Scholars go back and forth on this, but I'm pointing this out to you just to show that Gospels are circulating and one Gospel writer is using the other. Now, we'll have lots of different scholars come up with who's copying off of whom, or who came first and who copied it second, but I just want to point out that obviously there's some copying going on here. That's the only real explanation for why there's word for word agreement in the double tradition between Luke and Matthew. Okay, let's look at the unique to Luke. There's 35% that's only in Luke. 35% of Luke's gospel over there in the lower left-hand column. I think it's teal blue if it's the color on your computer. But 35% of Luke only appears there. What might some of this be? Well, the shepherds at Christmas, only in Luke. The manger only appears in Luke. Only Luke gives us these elements of the Christmas story. They don't appear in any other gospel. Likewise, only Luke gives us the magnificent parable of the Good Samaritan. Can't find that in any of the three gospels. Only Luke gives us the story of the good thief who dies next to Jesus on the cross. Jesus dies between two other robbers, and the other gospels, not in Luke, only Luke relates the story of the good thief. Now you may be thinking, is one right or the other wrong? No, don't do that. You can't pick between Matthew, Mark, and Luke like this. Matthew and Luke describe Jesus dying between revolutionaries and robbers. Luke adds the good thief. It does not mean that one's right and the other is wrong. What it could mean is that one of those robbers had a conversion during his time on the cross. One of those robbers becomes the good thief at the moment of his death and has a deathbed conversion. So there are all kinds of plausible reasons for this. But what I'm showing you here is that only Luke has the story of the good thief. Okay, let's look over at Matthew. What's unique to Matthew only? 20% of Matthew's gospel only appears in Matthew. 20% of his gospel is unique to Matthew. So this would be the parable of the sheep and goats towards the end of Matthew's gospel, when at the last time Jesus is going to divide the sheep on his right, the goats on his left. That magnificent parable only in Matthew. Only Matthew gives us the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Those guys who get hired at different times of the day, and then the last get the same amount for their pittance of a work compared to those who worked all day long. That's only in Matthew's gospel. Likewise, only Matthew gives us the Magi. They are only in Matthew's gospel. They do not appear in any of the other three. So 20% of Matthew's gospel is unique to him. Since we're still on this, look, 10% of Matthew is shared with Mark. So 10% of Matthew's gospel is in Mark, but not in Luke. And let's just keep going around this image here. 18% that Mark has is shared with Matthew. Unique to Mark, only 3%. That's an interesting thing that we're going to have to explain. Only 3% is in Mark only. That's not taken up by the other Gospels. Again, another reason why Mark was written first. But also notice 3% of Mark's Gospel is shared with Luke. Luke has 1% that's in Mark, but not in Matthew. So we can see interesting evidence that's going to shape an explanation. It's going to shape a theory. Let me give you that theory now. What might explain all of the percentages that I gave you in terms of how much of which gospel appears in the other one, and how Matthew and Luke have parts that are just word for word the same? Well, the dominant hypothesis right now is called the two-source hypothesis. And you see that here. Notice it has Mark as the source for Matthew and Luke. Mark is easily the shortest gospel of the four, and there's only about 3% that's in Mark only. Just about everything else in Mark has been taken up into Matthew and Luke, and so you see that there with the arrows. So there's so very little that's just in Mark, or even that's just in Mark and Luke that's not in Matthew, or vice versa, in Mark and Matthew that's not in Luke. Mark clearly seems to be a source for Matthew and Luke. But he's not the only source. This explains the triple tradition of the percentages in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what explains that copying between Matthew and Luke, the double tradition, where Matthew and Luke have things word for word the same? One explanation is that one copied off of the other. That could explain it. But there's another explanation that's also the dominant hypothesis now, that they both copied off of something else. That there was some document that was circulating around that they both had a copy of, and that they just took word for word into their respective Gospels. This is called Q. What explains the double tradition, and Matthew and Luke word for word the same in about 40% of their Gospels, is that they're both copying off of something else called Q. Now Q comes from the German word Quelle, which just means source. So Q is a source for Matthew and Luke. They have Mark as a source, and we saw the percentages for that, but they also have Q as a source. Now, what was Q? We don't have a copy of it. We don't have any proof that Q ever existed. It exists to explain why Matthew and Luke have sections of their gospel that are word for word the same. Scholars speculate that Q was what was called a sayings source, that Q was not a full-blown gospel, that it didn't have events narrated from the life of Christ. Instead, Q was just a source of sayings of Jesus. So some of the sayings of Jesus were written down, copied down, and circulated before a gospel was written, just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And so the brood of vipers that appears in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark, that brood of vipers, that was one of Jesus' sayings, one of his sayings against the Pharisees. And so Q primarily consists of different maxims, different teachings, different sayings, different sayings from Jesus, but not full-blown gospel events that were narrated. So this is one theory, that the sayings of Jesus first circulated before a gospel was written, and that accounts for the double tradition, the word-for-word agreement between Matthew and Luke. Now, just when you think that it's complicated enough, there are even more sophisticated theories that are presented. This is called the four-source hypothesis. Do not freak out when you see this slide or see this image here. You do not have to know this, but it shows you how sophisticated and how complicated some of these source theories can become. This is called the four-source theory. Notice for Matthew, he has Mark as a source, and we've seen the percentages of Mark that's in Matthew. Matthew has Q as a source, part of the double tradition. But there's also what's called the Antiochian document. There's one theory that there was a Hebrew gospel that circulated that Matthew used as well. We don't have any proof of that. We've never found it. Maybe one day we will. But then there are other parts of Matthew's gospel that are only in Matthew. That's explained by M. Look at Luke. We see Mark as his source. We have maybe a Q source that goes into what's called a proto-Luke or an early Lucan version of the gospel. We have L up there to explain some of the unique features of Luke that appear nowhere else. We have the document of infancy hypothesis here as far as the Christmas story. Now, I don't subscribe to all of these. I think we can allow the evangelist to be inspired and to through the inspiration of God, to write gospel elements that are unique to him, that do not have to be documented by some source that's floating around before. This, to me, is overblown and overly complicated. And there was one man who wrote something like, if you subscribe to this, it looks like it's gospel by committee, that the gospel evangelist is just stitching together, cutting and pasting all these different sources. This seems to be too far-fetched to me, the four-source hypothesis. I think we can allow Matthew and Luke, through the inspiration of God, the freedom to also write aspects of their gospels that don't have to be derived from some pre-existing source. That the evangelist was an author in his own right, and so, as such, as an author, inspired by God, he can be allowed the freedom to develop parts of his gospel based on earlier testimony of Jesus that don't have to be derived from some pre-existing source, as we see here. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I just dropped my clicker. Thank you very much for your attention on this module. I've taken an initial stab at why the Gospels are different. We need to account for them. Scholars have published lots of articles and books trying to explain these. None of them has been completely, entirely convincing. They explain some things, but they don't explain all the different elements that we need to have explained here for a definitive answer. We can learn a lot, all the while remaining convinced that the Gospels are inspired narratives, biographies about the life of Jesus. Okay, We will continue to explore this in other detail in the next module. Until then, thank you for your attention on this one. Reading assignments on the syllabus, threaded discussion awaits. Till the next time, goodbye and God bless.